Um, and yeah, if things don't improve, like, I always have to say, like, as much as you hate it, you gotta find someone who can get you medical care, because I can't prescribe things. Like, I can't really even give medical advice. All I can do is make recommendations based on my own personal experience. And then we talked, I guess we really didn't talk really much about fentanyl. These initial facts you've probably already heard by like a zillion different newscasters, but it's a synthetic opioid, 50 times more potent than heroin and 80 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. It's cheap to manufacture. Basically, it's always been around this country. It used to be called China White. And then people realized that they could order it from China because it was legal. And then people realized that there were tons of these analogs. So now there are these clandestine labs that are able to just switch from analog to analog to analog to kind of like evade the law. And you need a whole less, so it's a lot easier to smuggle it like around the country. So it spreads really fast. And the unfortunate thing is that many individuals consume fentanyl without their knowledge, while others are intentionally using fentanyl because of their potency. And I think a lot of the time you hear like in the news like this tragic story about like this kid that like bought a Xanax bar and like it had fentanyl and he died, and like, yeah, that's definitely tragic, but like it's just as tragic as a young kid who is like actually really addicted to fentanyl. Who I met a lot of people who were like, yeah, I don't even want heroin. Like I like the new thing is fentanyl. Like, it's like stronger, it's faster, it kind of goes along with the culture in a weird, scary way. So it is partly responsible for the current overdose crisis in the country, but it's really like lack of resources, criminalization of people who use drugs, how like toxic the supply is. Like, again, a lot of people don't know, like, a lot of people will buy cocaine. They don't want fentanyl in there. There's fentanyl in there. And, like, say they don't have a strip, or, like, it's just about, like, educating people to, like, test their shit, test your shit as much as you possibly can. Because we really just don't know. And some fallacies, despite those ridiculous videos that you saw of cops falling over like stiff boards, you cannot overdose by touching fentanyl. It has to pass through your mucous membrane and must be introduced to your bloodstream. So that is not true. Also, fentanyl is not naloxone resistant. It is a opioid. So an opioid antagonist is going to work for it. There is like this rumor that goes around that like it's naloxone resistant, and that's not true. Sometimes it requires more naloxone, but it will eventually work. So it should always be used. And like this picture right here, like I don't know if you guys remember last Halloween where all the stuff they could talk about was how they made like colored fentanyl because they were targeting children. And it's like, no, dude, that's marketing. Like, someone will have like the yellow one, like, yo, I got that yellow fire. Like, it's like how they use stamps on bags back in the day. Like, it's always goes back to like they're trying to target kids. And again, we talked about xylazine a little bit, the trank dope. This was a picture of a woman from, I believe it was a Washington Post article. And we kind of talked about a lot of the stuff, how it's naloxone resistant. And I also mentioned this with the drug testing. Sam, if you can switch for me. This is an example. I had a chance to go to another SSP in Boston that is like funded by the state. And that is a mass spectrometer machine that is going to give you the most accurate results of what is actually in a substance. The strips are a great tool, but they give false positive, false negatives all the time. There are like certain analogs that it can't pick up. Like the amount of shit that is in the supply, like you can't keep up fast enough really to pick it up. So this is the best way, but they're extremely expensive. But this is an example of like, and I know it's hard to read, but this was sold as a Xanax pill, analyzed by the mass spec, shows presence of fentanyl and trank or xylazine. So like, Xanax is really popular with young people. Like, it's obvious why these things, and also like maybe like it adds to the amount of, or the rapidness in which people become addicted to what they're getting from a certain person and kind of like hooks them in. That's why a lot of amazing harm reductionists will like go right to dealers, because a lot of dealers actually care about what's in their stuff, and like they will like take actions because like they want to like help out people. It's kind of rare nowadays that like, I don't know, it usually comes from desperation, to be honest, if people are selling this stuff. And like the chocolate chip cookie effect is just like another example of when you're maybe like testing out a pill that you got, and it just means like when you're testing it with the strip to kind of crush it and maybe like take a couple crumbs out of different areas from it. A lot of times I would just do it with bags that just had residue from like an exchange as like science experiments. And like you can just like empty out your drugs, have the residue, put a couple of drops of water, put your strip in, and it will work. And like this is like an example of me doing that at my old job. And you can see the one, and I always joke that like it's the opposite of every other fucking test on planet Earth, where 1 means positive and 2 means negative. Yeah, so you can see that that's a positive one. This is from Drugs Data, that website that I was talking about, where you can like literally search by zip code and it will like tell you like what it looks like, what it like was presented as, what's actually in it. You can like research what all these chemicals are, which I'm a nerd, I really find that interesting. And like it's also like an M30, like this would be a perk 30, so this would be something that would be really common to see on the street. And then also this is just like the dance safe. They consider themselves to be, they have new strips that they think are better, much better, and so they have their own little instructions of how to use those. And then quickly, medication for opioid use disorder, and this is something that is like really, applicable for right now in the current social climate. Like, we just had a massive movement because during COVID, they made it possible for you to get telehealth appointments where you were prescribed like an MAT medication. And so it really helped with accessibility, especially people who can't leave the house because of health issues. And they're trying to repeal that and take that away. So a lot of harm reductionists were able to write comments on this government website about how many people that we've worked with that we've seen these medications make miracles for real. These medications are what help on the front line, and this can either help a person transition off a substance, or they can just stay on a lot of these long term, and that's completely fine also. I've seen a lot of people get pressured by a recovery community to maybe come off an MAT medication earlier than they're actually comfortable with, and then they end up having a recurrence. So I have to take my antidepressants for the rest of my life. So it's if you look at it as that thing, is that it's something that's keeping you healthy with a chronic illness like substance use disorder. This is stuff that just needs to become more accessible. So we have methadone. This is a synthetic opioid that will bind to your receptors. It eliminates withdrawal and relieves cravings, and you have to go generally to get it every day at opioid treatment programs, and that comes along with a lot of stigma, a lot of what they refer to as liquid handcuffs, where you have to make all this time in your day to get there and get your medication. And that's really hard if you're trying to rebuild your life and you're trying to hold down a job, and it's difficult how many barriers there are. And then there's buprenorphine, or bup as people call it, Suboxone and Sublocade. I've seen amazing things happen with this. It's a partial opioid agonist, meaning that it binds to the same opioid receptors but does not completely activate them. So whereas you can get high from methadone, and you still can technically get high if you take too much Suboxone, but less so, because it's not completely binding with those receptors. But it will still reduce those cravings and withdrawal symptoms, and a lot of people are able to lead completely normal lives on Suboxone and raise a family and work a job and participate in society and communities and recovery. And an abstinence-based recovery is still sort of looked down upon, which kind of sucks. And then finally, there's naltrexone or Vivitrol, and I've kind of been tempted to stop including this on here because there's a lot of information coming out about Vivitrol and how it isn't effective as it was originally presented to be, and that it actually wears off a lot faster than they initially predicted, which is leading to more overdoses, because people are always going to want to push that boundary and see if they can get high. A lot of times what I've seen, some of the victories with this has been maybe with stimulants or maybe with alcohol in combination with other medications, but really less so with opiates.
Can I ask a question?
What's up?
I cannot get past this, and it's been, forever, that I don't understand. Methadone gets you high.
Well, It depends on like what your tolerance already is. Like,
But it's an opioid. It's a synthetic opioid that
Yes.
binds to your receptors just like fentanyl and just like heroin.
but it doesn't have that same potency.
Okay.
So it's like activating those receptors, but again, it's like controlled. It's not going to be contaminated with anything, and it's also going to do the like basic like function of satiating those receptors without having to like use.
So is there a street market for methadone?
There's a street market,
Oh,
and there's definitely a big street market for Suboxone,
okay.
especially in prisons because it's very easy to smuggle.
And because they get you high.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering that because that's just something that I had never run into. Like I've never heard of.
Yeah, and
Those
again,
things being-
it's like set and setting, right? Like, if you're coming down off fentanyl, methadone ain't getting you high, it's just helping you not be sick. Same thing with like Suboxone. But if you're using like a shit ton of Suboxone and maybe like your tolerance is way down and like, or you've been previously abstinent, like, yeah, you're gonna get high from that because your body always like adjusts back to like a sort of equilibrium. Like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So now, are you educating people on the streets about nowadays with the fentanyl, like how long it stays like in your body compared to actual heroin? The precip. Are you educating about the Bernese method of induction?
No, I haven't heard. I'd love to hear what that is.
So it's the technique of taking small amounts of subs, taking a minute amount while continuing.
Yes, I have heard of this.
Yeah, it's
actually.
called the Bernese method.
Yeah.
It's so you don't, cause like I'm a former opiate addict, and for me, like last time I cold turkey because of fear. Like I waited 72 hours once, 72 fucking hours and took one, and still went into precip.
Yeah. So
I know for other people too, like outside myself, like like subs are extremely scary in this day and age
yes.
because, and then the other thing too I wanted to ask is, because you said you were a nerd about the drugs data stuff, are you educating people about the zines that are hitting the streets?
So I am trying as much as I can to like always be talking about xylazine
No,
and
not xylazine, zines. They're different.
oh, like the informational things.
No, ZENES. They're a new wave coming in that's stronger than fentanyl.
Is this the
Like the Tinazine?
yes, I've heard of this.
Yeah.
It's like the more powerful version
Yes.
of the tranquilizer. Yeah, so right now my co-founder and I have been, because the only people that are writing any literature on this are generally like researchers, so we end up just like cold turkey emailing like researchers that are like studying this, like, hey, what are your results, like how can we apply this? And like that is the best thing that we are able to do. And I do talk a lot about precepts in the overdose response because of the application of naloxone sending people into precepts. But I think it's definitely important to include that like people who are using fentanyl, because it is a much faster acting drug, it has a much shorter shelf life, so like people who are using multiple times a day are like people who would be like subsisted by heroin are using more fentanyl more often. So like whereas you use, it's just people going into withdrawal quicker and quicker, so they're having to use more and more often. Is that what you're referring to?
What with I was referring to the fact that even though fentanyl has a short like acting life of like effects, that in your system, if it's not pharmaceutical fentanyl, it sticks. It's a lipid soluble, whereas heroin is water soluble. Fentanyl is lipid, so it stays in your fat a lot longer, and that's why it'll go into precip after 72 hours.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
I'm a nerd about this shit too. So.
Yeah, no, I like. This is the best way that I learn stuff is just listening to people.
Because a lot of people will say that, like, because it's a shorting acting opiate, that they're like, oh, you can take the sub, like, at the 24-hour mark still. And that's, like, not the truth nowadays. Like,
Yeah.
you cannot take it at that 24-hour mark.
Yeah, because you can't make it to that.
It's not even making it that. Even if you do make it, you go into precip after 24 hours.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's why I brought up the Bernese method with the buprenorphine subs, because that's the most successful way to induce any sort of subs at the moment,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else have any
I
questions?
have to go, it's 9 o'clock, but thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
I'll see you
you.
next week.
Sorry we're running a little bit over.
Sorry, I just have to scoot now.
Totally
Thanks a lot.
understand.
See you.
Anybody else also who has to go, I totally understand that. Sorry for running over.
No, not at all. How much longer do you think the presentation is supposed to?
It's pretty quick after this. Yeah, I can like skip over some stuff, and you guys can always like reference the paperwork. But yeah, basically I just have my little tree of stigma, because all these things really come back to stigma. So things that decrease the power of it are just, again, actively using people who use drugs for their expertise, like you just showed. Building relationships and trust with people who use drugs, like, you know, validating that was their experience and like I believe you, and then we'll use that information to like better serve people. And like, yeah, I think that's the back and forth that like needs to happen more often. And like also just considering how past histories of violence and trauma, layers of disadvantage and stigma affect a person's ability to engage with providers. So like, you know, providers will be like, I'm helping people, and they don't understand why people may react negatively or angrily to them, when really it's stemming from something that's completely unrelated to that person. And it's just like giving people that space to understand that, and that services are grounded in how people's health priorities and experiences are shaped by criminalization. Because again, like, we have to emphasize that this is all like stuff that's like underground information, not necessarily like you have to actively spread. So like, you know, the war on drugs, it's just had disastrous results. So I really think education is the answer to that. And just using people first language, and I don't want to go too into that because we're over, but that's just saying like, instead of saying like a drug user, it's like a person who uses drugs. Like, they're not defined by those drugs, they're just, that's something that they're doing right now that they might not do later. That it's just, it's centering the person in the conversation. And then just quickly on Point NYC, it is the US's first overdose prevention center. It was first legalized in Canada, but New York City has opened it, and it has just been a tremendous success. If data is really what lawmakers listen to, then they have the data that shows that this is a huge success. People are able to like test their stuff. If someone falls out, there's someone there to revive them. People can make sure that they're injecting correctly so they're doing the least amount of damage. Like, it's just doing it out in the open instead of keeping it behind closed doors, which is the best way to reduce the stigma. So yeah, it's going to be like a state by state battle, but yeah, more safe or overdose prevention sites, I think they just lead to safer communities, they lead to cleaner communities, lead to less public use. Like, it just has so many benefits. And then I'll just go quickly through this, but this is something that I've been getting into recently. It's harm reduction for incarcerated folks. If anybody is interested, this is what something called a SIRET. This is what they would use to intramuscularly inject morphine on the battlefield. And that is basically the state of what people are using in prisons right now. They call them binkies because they're often like made through Visine bottles. But yeah, it's really intense, and like all these articles I've been able to access through my very good friend's brother, Jonathan Kirkpatrick, who has been incarcerated for a long amount of time and is a HIV positive and is a prison harm reductionist who is incarcerated. And he is just a wonderful journalist. He's a wonderful writer, and like, I would, if any of you are interested in that, he writes for Filter Mag. But he talks a lot about how any education and prison system right now, which goes from clean equipment to Hep C and HIV transmission, comes from lifers and long-timers. It doesn't come from the guards. There is no education. So again, it's like that passing of knowledge on to people. That is how that word gets around. And he even like included in an article about CEOs that if someone appears to be overdosing, they won't administer Narcan or naloxone because it doesn't work on fentanyl. And that he also found in like a series of interviews that he did that a good portion of prisoners also believes that because they were told by prison guards that naloxone does not work on fentanyl. And so like a third said that Narcan training didn't include anything about rescue breathing. So, it's about training being important, but also like just basic stuff like it being accessible. Like Narcan was only kept in the control booth. Have it on hand. Like, I can't even say like if you hide it away, it's going to defeat the purpose. But hopefully this will become more and more valued to people, and I'm working a little bit on that. And then the most important thing is just not to use alone. Super basic stuff, but maybe some of the most valuable advice that I can give to anyone. And that is because we know that if a person uses alone and overdoses, there is no possibility to revive them. And it's just not a good situation. So, and this often happens because of stigma and shame, and like it's a secret. But there are like some programs that are coming up. Never Use Alone is a nationwide program. It is amazing. I volunteer for it too. Basically, if you have to use alone, you can just call this number And like all you have to give is maybe like a nearby emergency room or even like a trusted friend that you know will pick up. And then like you can just use on the phone and just shoot the shit and talk. And like if they fall out, it's pretty obvious, but like most of the time you're just like having a conversation and just making sure that person is safe, of like not judging them. It's pretty fucking simple actually, but it's a life-saving service. And like I have a friend who is developing this app Brave, which does similar stuff with drug spotting, but they're like an app, so you can message if you don't feel comfortable, maybe like talking on the phone or whatever. There's all kinds of accessibility things. I'll just kind of this is just like abstinence-based recovery, bad effects. Abstinence violation effect is just like if you relapse, then you've lost your days, you've lost your credibility, you've lost your community, and it drives a lot more people out into like full-blown. And being able to accept people that they haven't lost everything, if they have a recurrence, that like that still counts and exists, that is like a really powerful thing to do nowadays. And then we have recovery readiness. Again, I'll go over this really quickly. It's basically just like a co-opted and stripped down version of harm reduction, again called public harm reduction. This is because so much money has been released from the government, so like anything, it waters it down. It cannibalizes it, basically. It just becomes just such a shitty, worse version of what it was born to be. And basically, it just says that recovery readiness is the concept that everything you do, the ultimate goal is abstinence and sobriety. And that maybe is not everybody's goal. And this is also steeped in like behavior modification strategies, like urine tests, how invasive that is to someone's body. And, you know, like if drug use is someone's coping strategy, you're threatening someone to stop with that coping strategy in exchange for like basic needs like housing, like healthcare, like therapy. Like it's coercive in nature. So it plays on that politic of respectability that stigma has created. It's steeped in the moral value that living life sober is better, and you are a better person if you are sober. And that's really what we're trying to fight more against. And we have the corporatization of harm reduction. I'll just kind of leave that if you guys want to review that. Finally, like last slide, we have Oregon's example of drug decriminalization. So in 2020, an initiative by the Drug Policy Alliance, Oregon decriminalized possession of personal use of any amount of drugs. So if you're caught with small quantities of cocaine, heroin, hallucinogens, meth, and other substances, you no longer face criminal penalties. You can either choose between a one-time treatment assessment or pay a $100 fine. And obviously there are problems with that because maybe not everybody has $100, or the treatment assessment there may be accessibility issues, but it's a whole lot better than facing a charge or being criminalized or having to go back through the criminal system. So the treatment systems include options like harm reduction programs. They offer access to other resources like housing, employment assistance. And if someone decides to leave, there's no punishment. They are free to go. And that is something that's really important, that people aren't coerced to stay because, like, there's this AA quote that's like, don't leave before you find the miracle or something like that. It's like, I gotta do what's best for me here. So it's all our life. And finally, like, the future of harm reduction is bright. Like, this might seem like a depressing topic, but like, it's actually really positive because we are like recreating those community bonds that I think a lot of people have like lost touch of, and we're like lifting each other up, like, despite what's going on. We are like accepting of all people, and like, I don't know, I think that as time goes on, like, hopefully we will be able to like make some kind of headway in helping with this overdose crisis, because it really can't get worse than the situation that we're in now. So like, we like the more we implement these, even if they seem like such small strategies in the face of such a huge problem, they add up. And like, small things matter, and like, ways that you treat people matter, and like, so living life like kind of just in a way where you see all people as people, you realize maybe like how society conditions you to treat people differently, and maybe like helps you actively like examine that about yourself. And like, I don't know, it's always good to like review what you really believe in. And finally, I just have a list of sources that you guys can all take a look at that I used throughout this. And like, last on here, I know a lot of people asked previously about like podcasts or like books or like sources that they could look into more. Like, a book that I referenced from a lot was Saving Our Own Lives. I really love this book. Undoing Drugs was also like unbelievable. Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. He's a professor at NYU. He writes a lot about the stigmatization of drug use, specifically in the African American community. So he is just, it's a great book. We also have Toward Bodily Autonomy, which has tons of different topics, not necessarily harm reduction. They have just a whole lot of different kind of sex work and just like different forms of justice. And then Last Day in Recovery and Crackdown are all great podcasts that I just personally found really helpful. But that's about it. And yeah, sorry we went over.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.